Assalamu alaikum. In today's lesson, we are going to discuss objective 8.2 from chapter number 8, Transport in Mammals. And the objectives are describe the external and internal structure of the mammalian heart, explain the differences in the thickness of the walls of different chambers in terms of the functions with reference to resistance to flow, describe the cardiac cycle, including blood pressure changes during systole and diastole, explain how heart action is initiated and controlled. Reference should be made to Sinoatrial Node, the Atrioventricular Node, and the Purkinje tissue, but not to the nervous and hormonal control. So let's move on to the slides then. So when we talk about the circulatory system, its main purpose is to facilitate a rapid mass flow of materials from one part of the body to another. Now, if you look at the mammalian heart, it actually is divided into three circuits. First one is known as the systemic circuit. And the systemic circuit is the one when the blood is sent from the heart to different parts of the body, except the lungs, right? That is known as systemic circulation. And this system is under high pressure because as the blood is pumped from the left ventricle, it is pumped into the aorta. Aorta has a like wider lumen, right, but narrow as compared if you think about the size of this left ventricle. So the blood is sent at the high pressure and then it is sent to different parts of the body, right? So this is known as systemic circulation. And when you talk about the second circuit, which is known as the pulmonary circulation, this means when the blood is sent from the heart, or rather from the right side of the heart to the lungs for oxygenation, right? And this is where the gases exchange takes place, right? This system, the pulmonary circulation is actually under low pressure. And the main reason is that because it has to go to the lungs, right? And this like gases exchange has to take place. So if the pressure is low, it will be possible then only. And the third one is actually the coronary circuit. So coronary branches actually are the one which branch off from the aorta, the main branch, and then they supply the muscle of the heart. So here you can look at the coronary arteries, and then they're branching off as they would supply blood to the heart muscle. So this is what we call as a coronary circuit, and coronary arteries branch off directly from the aorta. Now, if you look at the heart muscle basically, or the cardiac muscle, it consists of three layers. The first layer is known as the pericardium. So this entire layer that you're looking at, this portion, this is the first, the top layer. This is known as the pericardial layer or pericardium. Then comes the myocardium. The myocardium is rather quite a thick layer. And then comes the endocardium that you're looking at, this thin layer that you're looking at here. This is the endocardium, right? So these three layers constitute a cardiac muscle. Then there's something very interesting about the cardiac muscles. They're considered to be myogenic. And myogenic means these muscles can contract and relax on their own. They're not under nervous or hormonal impulses at all. Like they only contract and relax on their own. And another interesting thing about that is that this cardiac muscle would never fatigue, provided there is a good supply of oxygen present. Unlike skeletal muscle, which actually, like after vigorous exercise or vigorous contraction, it gets fatigued. You might feel cramps, you might feel pain, but the heart keeps on pumping throughout the life and it does not fatigue, right? So these are two interesting things about the cardiac muscle basically. So here we are looking at single circulation and double circulation, just to see the difference between these two. Mammals are said to have double circulation, so we just see in a while why is it said so. If you consider this example of a fish basically, so you can see the heart muscle actually supplies blood to the gills, right, where diffusion of gas takes place, and then the oxygenated blood goes to the body, right, and after that, deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart. So if you look at this diagram very closely, it shows you a single pathway of blood flow. So blood leaves the heart, right, and then it goes to the body and then comes back to the heart. So this is known as single circulation. So in a single circulation, the blood travels from the heart to the gills, right? Where it absorbs oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. It then flows from the gills to the organs and tissues in the rest of the body and then back to the heart. So there's only one way flow. Now comparing that to the double circulation, so here you're looking at the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. And what you notice is that in this case here, if you focus on the left side of the heart first, blood is pumped into the aorta under high pressure, right? And then it goes to different parts of the body where definitely it branches off into arteries, arterioles, and then capillaries, and then diffusion takes place. And then the deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart, right? So what you notice here is that like blood leaves the heart, right? And it supplies different parts of the body, and then it comes back to the heart, right? Then if you focus on the right hand side here, on the right side of the heart here, so you must also be noticing that blood is pumped into the lungs as well, right? And this is what we call as a pulmonary circulation, a pulmonary circuit. So blood is pumped into the lungs for oxygenation. So this is the part where actually oxygenation of the blood would take place. And then this oxygenated blood would come back to the heart, right? So here what we're looking at actually blood goes to the heart 2 times. So we have this double circulation. So it through the aorta, it goes to different parts of the body through systemic circulation, which is under high pressure, right? And then from the heart, it goes into the lungs as well, where the like gas exchange takes place, and then the oxygenated blood comes back to the heart as well, right? So this is known as the pulmonary circulation, and this is where the blood is under lower pressure, right? So we have already talked about the 3 circuits. So blood passes from the heart to the lungs. We are talking about this one right now, where it absorbs oxygen, releases carbon dioxide, then back to the heart, right? Then blood passes from the heart to the organs and tissues in the body, and then back to the heart again, right? And we have already talked about this coronary circuit, where it is supplied to the heart muscle and then returned back to the heart, right? So these are basically the difference between single circulation and double circulation. Mostly we are focusing on the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. But yes, heart muscle has its own blood supply as well, because definitely these metabolic processes goes on there as well, and heart needs to be supplied by the coronary arteries. So what is meant by double circulation? This means that we have 2 transport systems. One carries blood from your heart to your lungs and back again. And the function of this part is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the air. And remember, this pulmonary circuit or pulmonary circulation has low pressure. And the other is when oxygen is sent around the body, and then definitely the blood comes back again. And the function of this part is to carry oxygen to the tissues and cells that need it and remove carbon dioxide. And this is under high pressure. So this double circulation has evolved basically it's just an ability to create more pressure to pump blood around the system, and then separation of oxygen rich and oxygen poor blood, right? So this is how, or this is why the double circulatory system has evolved. So the first point here stands for the systemic circulation, right? And here in this case for the pulmonary circulation. Okay, this is another diagrammatic view of pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation. So you can have a look here. This is the left side of the heart. And then you can follow the arrows. The blood is pumped through the left ventricle into the aorta, and then it goes to different parts of the body. So you can see they've shown the upper body, and then definitely at the tissue level, gas exchange takes place. Then you can see, because aorta then keeps on dividing into arteries. So it goes to the liver, where we call it as a hepatic artery, and definitely the blood is taken back via hepatic vein, then hepatic portal vein, right? Then you can see the renal artery, the kidneys, and the blood from the lower body, right? All this then comes back to the heart via these veins, and then through the inferior vena cava here, actually, it enters the right side of the heart, right? And definitely, like if you look at the right side now, so the blood is pumped into the lungs, where gas exchange takes place, and then the oxygenated blood comes back to the heart, right? So this is what we call as a pulmonary circulation, right? And this here is what we call as a systemic circulation. So this part here is under high pressure. This is under low pressure. Okay then, so circulatory system has three distinct characteristics. It has a circulatory fluid, which we call blood. It has blood vessels, so definitely we need these transport systems to carry blood to different parts of the body. And then definitely heart. It's a contractile device which pumps the blood, right? So these are the three different characteristics that a circulatory system have. So you can look here at this vast network of arteries and veins. So this is an anterior view of the heart. You can see the heart actually divided into 4 chambers. So this here actually is what we call as a right atrium, right? This is the upper chamber. So this is known as the right atrium, right? And here what you're looking at is the left atrium. So this is the left atrium. This is the right atrium, right? And then below that is the right ventricle here. This is the right ventricle. Then here you're looking at the left ventricle, right? These two, then you can see they are divided by the septum here, right? And then you can look at the aorta, okay? And then you can look at it as like branching off into different branches, which will supply different parts of the body. Then you can also look at the pulmonary artery. So this one would go towards the left lung, so we call it as left pulmonary artery. Then this one would go towards the right lung, we call it the right pulmonary artery. So this is the superior vena cava, so it is bringing the deoxygenated blood from the head and the neck. And this is the inferior vena cava, which is bringing deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body, right? Then you also notice here these chordae tendineae, right? And they are actually connecting these valves to the muscle here. What else do you notice here? And yes, you can see these pulmonary veins as well. Okay, so again, these left pulmonary veins are coming from the lungs. So you can see two here. These are the right pulmonary veins, and then from the back of the heart, they will actually open here into the left atrium. Right, so we'll talk about all these in detail. And then yes, you can look at the layers as well. So the first layer is the pericardium, then this thicker layer is the myocardium, okay? And then the inner layer is the endocardium, right? Okay, so the wall of the heart contains 3 layers: pericardium, the first layer, then comes the myocardium, and then the endocardium, right? The pericardium secretes pericardial fluid. Pericardial fluid actually it reduces the friction when the heart beats. So here you can look at this outer layer, right? And then you can see a little the darker portion that they've shown you here is this is the part which would contain the pericardial fluid. So as the heart beats, it actually reduces the friction. Then the heart consists of 4 chambers, as we're just looking at this diagram, the previous one, but then this is more clear. So you can look at the 4 chambers. So we have 2 atria. So this is very like a clear diagram here. So you can look at the right atrium here, right? Here you're looking at the left atrium, right? Then you're looking at the ventricle. So this one is the right ventricle. This is the left ventricle. Then you can also notice the valves here. So these are known as the atrioventricular valves because they are actually between the atrium and the ventricle. So you can see one here, and then you can see one here as well, right? So these are the valves. Then you can also see these here are known as the semilunar valves, which are actually between the ventricle and the arteries, right? So this is the right ventricle, and here you can look at this is the pulmonary artery. So we have a semilunar valve here, which we call as a pulmonary valve as well, right? And then here you can see there is a valve between the left ventricle, and then like it will connect to the aorta here that you're looking at. So this is known as the aortic valve. So these semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries. The atrioventricular valves here and here are between the atrium and the ventricle, right? Then you can also look at this atrioventricular septum as well, which actually divides the heart into halves. So here you're looking at the septum between the ventricles, but then since this diagram is actually it's cut here from the front, but it's there, a thin layer is present between the 2 atria as well, right? So it's atrioventricular septum. It divides the heart into 2 different hearts, and the basic purpose is that the deoxygenated blood here does not mix with oxygenated blood on this side. So let's focus on the chambers first. So we will be talking about the right atrium and the left atrium. So if you actually look at the wall here, so this is the right atrium, then you look at the wall, and then again you look at the wall of the left atrium as well. So these are actually less muscular in both the cases. The wall is thin and less muscular. And then if you focus on the right atrium first, so you can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava here, right? They open into this chamber. So you're looking at here, the superior vena cava is also opening into the right atrium, and the inferior vena cava, which is bringing deoxygenated blood from the lower part of the body, is also opening here, right? So it means this right atrium actually has two openings, right? One from the top for the superior vena cava, one here at the bottom for the inferior vena cava, right? Then right atrium here opens into the right ventricle, right? But this opening is actually guarded by this atrioventricular valve, and it is also known as tricuspid valve. Tricuspid means it has three flaps, right? It has three flaps. Let me write it here. So it has three flaps, right? So this atrioventricular valve, or the right atrioventricular valve rather, is known as tricuspid valve. It has got three flaps, and it is actually this is an opening, okay, which actually separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Okay, then looking at the left atrium, so yes, the wall is thin, less muscular, because if we compare these with the ventricular walls are very thick, right? So this is actually thin. And then you can see that 4 pulmonary veins open into this chamber. So you are looking at these two here, they are actually coming from the left lung, but then these are actually like coming from behind, and then actually they have their opening here as well. So these are coming from these are the right pulmonary veins, which are coming from the right lung, okay? But then they will actually open up here into the left atrium. So it has got 4 openings for pulmonary veins. These open into the left ventricle. Then you can see this left atrium. It opens in the left ventricle. Here is the left ventricle. Okay, and then this valve is known as the left atrioventricular valve or bicuspid valve, right? Or it is also known as mitral valve, right? So all these different names for it. So it is also known as mitral valve or bicuspid valves. Now bicuspid means it has got 2 flaps. Right? It has got 2 flaps here, right? So the blood will come in from the left atrium into the left ventricle only when this valve opens, the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve opens, then the blood will enter from the left ventricle into the, left atrium into the left ventricle, right? So this much about the right atrium and the left atrium. Okay, coming to the ventricles now. So the right ventricle, if you look at the wall here, so the walls are rather thicker. If you compare that to the right atrium here, so the walls are rather thicker, right? And the wall has got cone-shaped projections. So you can see here these, okay? So they have got cone-shaped projections, which we call as papillary muscles. And then you can also see the pulmonary artery arises from the right ventricle. So you can see this is the right ventricle. And here you can see this is the pulmonary artery. So blood is pushed from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery, right? And this opening of the artery, this opening here is actually guarded by the semilunar valves. And since they are opening into the pulmonary artery, we call them as pulmonary valves or pulmonic valves. Right, so these are semilunar valves. Semilunar valves also have 3 flaps, right? So let me again write it here. So these valves have got 3 flaps, okay? And it is also known as like you can say these valves are made up of 3 cusps or 3 flaps, right? Then pulmonary artery moves towards the superior side in front of the atria. So let me show you here. So this is the pulmonary artery. Then you can see it is bifurcating into the left side and then into the right side. So this pulmonary artery moves towards the superior side. It goes up in front of the atrium, right? So you can see this is the right atrium. Okay, it goes like in front of it. and then it bifurcates, forming the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. So the left pulmonary artery would go to the the left pulmonary artery would go to the left lung. The right pulmonary artery would go to the right lung. Right. So this much about the right ventricle. So the walls are thicker as compared to the atrium. Okay. And then you can see these cone-like projections here, which are known as the papillary muscles. Like in this diagram, it's not much clear, but I'll show you in another diagram. These valves actually are connected to the papillary muscles via chorda tendineae. So this and then this pulmonary artery arises from the right ventricle, and then it bifurcates into the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, and coming to the left ventricle. Here the walls are very thick. They're even thicker than the right ventricle, right? So this part of the heart is the most muscular. So the walls are thicker, and then you can see aorta actually arises from the left ventricle. So as the blood is pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta. So you can look at the valve here as well. So this again, semilunar valve contains 3 cusps or 3 flaps, and this is known as aortic valve. And then you can look at this aorta. It then branches off to again further different arteries, right? And then the front of the muscles of the heart basically will then come out from the aorta, and then they will supply the wall of the ventricle as well, right? So this much about the left ventricle. All right, then I'm coming to the septum, which if you look at this diagram, and this one is actually an inverted version. Here you're looking at here, like since it's upside down. So these are the atria, okay? So left atria and the right atrium, right? Then here you're looking at the septum, right? So the septum actually separates the ventricles, right? And then you can see a thin septum here between the atria as well, right? And it separates the left and the right heart. And so this one here, which is present between the atria, is known as interatrial septum, right? This is the top part. Okay? And then this one here between the 2 ventricles is what we call as the interventricular septum, right? And again, as we were talking about the papillary muscles, so these are the papillary muscles. This is a much clearer diagram. So these are the cone-shaped papillary muscles, and these are the chordae tendineae, right? So these actually are attached to the papillary muscle as well as to the flaps there, okay? And then like as these muscles contract, okay, so they will actually keep these flaps open. Right? So this is the papillary muscle, and these are the chordae tendineae. So you can see here, then you can see here as well. So see, connected to the papillary muscle. These are the chordae tendineae. So the tricuspid valve here, then the bicuspid and mitral valve here. All right then. Coming to valves, valves are important in that they actually control the flow of blood from one chamber of the heart to the other. And they actually make sure that the blood flows only in one direction. Right, so here actually they've shown you the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve only has 2 flaps, right? Tricuspid have 3 cusps or 3 flaps. You can see here 1, 2, 3. Bicuspid has 2. Then the semilunar valves, right, which are the ones between the ventricles and the arteries. So here they've shown you the aortic valve. These are the semilunar valves, and it also has 3 flaps, as you can see. Aortic valve, right? And here they've shown you the pulmonary valve. Also semilunar, also contains the 3 flaps. So it's only the bicuspid valve that contains 2 flaps. The rest of them, both of the semilunar valves as well as the tricuspid valve, they contain 3 flaps. Then you can actually have here it's also visible the coronary artery, the right coronary artery, and this is the left coronary artery. This is just applying the muscles of the heart. So we have talked about these as well. So tricuspid valve is opening between the right atria and the right ventricle. Then pulmonary semilunar valve is the opening between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. The mitral valve, also known as bicuspid, opening between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Then aortic semilunar valve, or you can simply rather just call it aortic valve, is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. Right? So these chordae tendineae, these structures here, right? They keep the valve flaps from flipping up into the atria, right? So as we said, direction of flow of blood from the valves is only one directional, unidirectional. They prevent the backflow of the blood, right? So these chordae tendineae, they make sure that the valves are not flipping up into the atria, right? And these are the papillary muscles. So once they're open, okay, so chordae tendineae actually ensure that. Then we talked about the valves as well, but just a recap. So this atrioventricular, the right atrioventricular valve here, or the tricuspid valve, the one in this part here, right? It's found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So right atrium, right ventricle, it has got 3 flaps, prevents the blood from flowing back into the right atrium. Okay, here's another diagram that you can look at. So this is the tricuspid valve. Okay, so it's a very clear diagram about the flaps as well. So you can look at the aortic valve, the pulmonary valve, and the mitral valve or the left atrioventricular valve. Then the pulmonic or the semilunar valve, right? It's between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. It prevents the blood from flowing back to the right ventricle. So here you can look at the pulmonic valve, right? And here you're looking at here as well. This is the pulmonary valve. Okay. Then left atrioventricular bicuspid valve, it's between the left atrium and the left ventricle, prevents blood from flowing back into the left atrium, has 2 flaps, mitral valve, so you can see the chordae tendineae, you can see the papillary muscle, this is the mitral valve, right, prevents backflow of blood from the left ventricle, the left atrium, and finally the aortic valve, right? So aortic valve here, you can see, so it prevents the blood flowing from the aorta back into the left ventricle, right? So this is known as the aortic valve. So this much about the valves. Then coming towards the blood vessels, the large blood vessels which are connected to the heart. So we have 2 veins, right? The 2 veins are known as Vena Cava or Vena Cava. So you can see. So Vena Cava this is the superior Vena Cava and then inferior Vena Cava, right? So they are bringing deoxygenated blood from the upper part of the body and the lower part of the body respectively. Vein simply means like a vessel which is bringing blood to the heart, right? So veins, you can remember like veins has IN, so you just can remember it by N. Okay. Vena Cava is actually, it means body vein because Vena definitely refers to vein, Cava means body, carries deoxygenated blood from the body to the right atrium. Then another vein that is present here is known as a pulmonary vein. And pulmonary vein actually carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. So here you can look at these are the pulmonary veins. So this is coming from the left lung, right? And then, it's here. So the left pulmonary veins actually would bring in oxygenated blood from the left lung, and the right pulmonary veins, again, they will loop back from behind, they will join here, okay? And then they would actually bring the oxygenated blood from the right lung. So both of them open into the left atrium, right? So this much about the veins. So this is the superior Vena Cava, inferior Vena Cava, okay? Then the left pulmonary vein and the right pulmonary vein, right? And though these pulmonary veins are bringing in oxygenated blood from the lungs to the atrium, right? But they're called as veins because they're bringing blood into the heart, right? Generally, like it's about the veins, it said they generally bring deoxygenated blood, but pulmonary vein is an exception, which brings oxygenated blood to the heart, right? Simply because of the reason, because it is bringing blood into the heart, So anything that brings blood into the heart is known as vein. And arteries, they take blood away from the heart, right? So pulmonary simply refers to the lungs. So 2 veins and then 2 arteries. Again, just as I was saying, artery starts with an A. So A is away from the heart. So we have 2 arteries, pulmonary artery, right? So this here is a pulmonary artery, right? So left pulmonary artery would be bringing or would be carrying actually deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle, right, into the left lung, and then the right would be carrying this deoxygenated blood to the right lung, right, to be oxygenated. So these are the pulmonary arteries. So right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery. And again, even though they're carrying deoxygenated blood, they're called arteries because they're taking blood away from the heart to the lungs for oxygenation, right? And then comes the aorta, the widest or the largest artery that carries oxygenated blood from the left ventricle to the rest of the body, right? So this much about the arteries. Arteries carry the blood away from the heart. So we have two, pulmonary artery and we have aorta. All right, so we've discussed about the structure of the heart. Let's talk about the cardiac cycle now. So this cardiac cycle actually involves series of events which takes place within a single heartbeat to perform a single cardiac output, which we call the cardiac cycle, right? So series of events within a single heartbeat, right? What happens at the atrial level, what happens at the ventricular level, how these arteries are involved, how these valves are involved. So all this we are going to study in the cardiac cycle. So it has three stages. The first is known as cardiac diastole. Now, again, some people call it diastole, some call it diastole, so it's totally up to you. So cardiac diastole means both the atria and the ventricles are actually relaxing at this time. Diastole means relaxing, systole means contraction, right? So it is generally referred to as ventricular diastole as well, right? So sometimes you will actually come across only ventricular diastole written, right? But it involves both, like atrial and ventricular relaxation. Then comes the atrial systole. Atrial systole means that the atria contract, right? And as we will discuss about these, so we will talk about the right and the left atrial together, right? Then comes the ventricular systole. So this is the part where the ventricles are contracting, right? So cardiac diastole, all the chambers are relaxed. All the chambers means both the atria and the ventricles. And this is the time when the blood is flowing into the heart. So you can look at the arrows as well. So this is what we call as a diastole. All the chambers are relaxed and the blood is flowing into the heart. Then atrial systole. Now atrial systole is the part when the atria are contracting. So we're talking about both the atria. Both of the atria are contracting and they're sending the blood into the ventricles, right? But when the atria are contracting, the ventricles are relaxing at that time, right? So atrial systole. At the same time, it is also ventricular diastole. So atria contract, pushing blood into the ventricles. So you can see the blood is pushed into the ventricles, right? Then you can look at here, it's actually the ventricular systole. Ventricles are contracting, but at the same time, you can see the atria are relaxed at this time now. So it's atrial diastole or ventricular systole. After the atria relax, the ventricles now contract, pushing blood out of the heart, right? So this is whole cardiac cycle, okay? And the events which take place during one heartbeat. So let's talk about diastole first. So in diastole, see, as we discussed, this is the part when both atria and the ventricles are relaxed. Blood is being, actually, it is entering into the chambers of the heart, all the chambers. So because of that, the pressure in the ventricle decreases, thus increasing the volume. When we're talking about the volume, it means that the blood is flowing in. So volume is this actually the capacity of this space to hold blood, right? So the volume is actually increasing, right? So the pressure, okay, so you can see the pressure here right now, since they're talking about the ventricle for right now, and they're referring as to as ventricular diastole first. So atria and ventricle relax, right? The pressure in the ventricle decreases, okay, and this is what actually increases the volume. The semilunar valves in the aorta and the pulmonary arteries close. Now these valves are closed right here, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, because right now the ventricles are relaxing, both the ventricles. So you can see the left ventricle as well as the right ventricle, right? Both of these are relaxing, so blood is being pushed in right now. Okay, they're filling with blood. The pressure is not that high, the ventricles have not contracted, so that these pulmonary and the aortic valves, there's no need for them to open right now. Okay, so they are kept closed at this stage during ventricular diastole, or simply you can call it as cardiac diastole, because both the atria and the ventricles both are relaxed at this time. Blood is coming in. Okay, so here it's coming in through the vena cava. Okay, and here it is coming in through the pulmonary veins. So blood is coming in through the atria, it is going into the ventricles. Semilunar valves, both the pulmonary and the aortic valves are closed. All the heart muscles are relaxing. Blood flows from the atria to the ventricle. So we see from the vena cava and the pulmonary vein, Blood pressure remains low at this stage inside the atria and the ventricles. It is simply being filled by blood right now. Okay, so blood pressure remains low inside the atria and the ventricles. So this is about the cardiac diastole, right? Or as I said, yes, sometimes you will only come across ventricular diastole, but remember cardiac diastole, it means both the chambers, atria as well as the ventricles, all are relaxed at this time. Coming to the atrial systole. Atrial systole is the part when the atria is going to contract, right? So in this case, again, we will refer to both the atria together. So muscles of the atria will contract. As the muscles contract, it decreases the volume. So as we say it decreases the volume, it means again look at the size. So when they're contracting, the size is becoming smaller. Okay, this is space here. Okay. So if you in fact focus it on this is when they were relaxed. So look at the size. Okay, there is much space here. Blood is being filled, right? But when they contract during atrial systole, so look at the size here. Okay, as the volume decreases, this is what increases the pressure now. Okay, we are talking about atrial systole right now. So the muscles of the atria, both the atria would contract. This would decrease the volume. This space here would decrease. As the space decreases, it increases the pressure inside the atria, right? And now what is happening? Because it is only the atria involved right now, atria is contracting, blood will be pushed into the ventricle, right? So semilunar valves will remain closed, right? There's no need for them to open right now, right? Because the ventricle will keep on filling, and only when the pressure becomes high and the ventricle contracts, only then these valves will open, right? So during atrial systole, remember these semilunar valves, they stay shut, right? But the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, they are open because of the reason that the atria is contracting. The blood has to be pushed from the atria into the ventricle, right? So these atrioventricular valves, these are open, and this will allow the blood to move in from the atria into the ventricle. This is what we call as atrial systole. Both the atria contract, blood flows from the atria into the ventricles, and again, backflow of the blood into the vein is prevented by the closure of valves in the veins, right? So again, these valves here, at the Vena Cava and the pulmonary veins, these are closed so that the blood which is flowing from the atria to the ventricle doesn't actually go back into these veins here, right? So this is prevented. So this is what is known as atrial systole, and because of that, finally, as the blood moves into the ventricle, then the pressure decreases, right? And this atrial systole, it lasts about 0.1 seconds, right? This atrial contraction, it lasts about 0.1 seconds. Now coming to the ventricular systole. Ventricular systole is when the ventricles are contracting, right? So these ventricles, as they contract, they have to send the blood into the arteries. So the right ventricle will be sending the blood into the pulmonary artery, and the left ventricle will be sending the blood to the aorta, right? So both the ventricles contract, right? And as they contract, and as the muscles of the ventricles are contracting, what will happen? Again, the size here is decreasing. So because of that, the volume is decreasing, but at the same time, the pressure is increasing. So if you refer to this from this diagram, so you'll see when they're relaxed. So look at the volume. There's much more capacity to hold blood right now. But as they contract, look at the shape now. And the contraction is, it generally takes in from down below from these muscles here. Right? So look at the size, right? So as the muscles of the ventricle contract, they would actually decrease the volume, but because of that, the pressure increases. The pressure inside the ventricles increases. Because of that, what happens now, this tricuspid and the bicuspid valves would close, right? Because again, this would prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricle into the atria, right? So these valves close. Semilunar valves in the aorta and the pulmonary valves open, right? So they do not open right away. So first the ventricle contracts, right? And as the blood moves in towards these valves, then they open, right? The semilunar valves in both the aorta and the pulmonary arteries would open, and this would then eventually decrease the pressure because the blood would now enter the aorta and the pulmonary artery, right? So this would now decrease the pressure. As the pressure is decreasing, so now the volume of these ventricular walls would increase now, right? So this lasts about 0.3 seconds. So atrial systole was taking 0.1 seconds, this ventricular contraction or ventricular systole takes about 0.3 seconds, right? So both ventricles contract, atrioventricular valves are pushed shut by the pressurized blood in the ventricles. The semilunar valves in the aorta and the pulmonary artery are pushed open. Blood flows from the ventricles into the heart. Okay, then let's talk about the changes in pressure, which is millimeter of mercury, and volume during the cardiac cycle. So we have talked about what happens during atrial systole, then ventricular systole, and then cardiac diastole, right? But because of all these, there are changes taking place in the pressure and volume, as we were already discussing in the previous slides, that as the volume is decreasing, it is increasing the pressure as they are contracting. But let's now talk about these in detail. So here in this cycle, like if you focus here, so here actually this part here is referring to how the muscles are relaxed at the time, ventricles are filling. Then here you can look at the atria is contracting, then the blood is being pushed into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles it is being pushed into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. But now let's talk about this. The inner circle actually here stands for the atria, right? And the outer circle that you're looking at here, it involves the ventricular part, right? So this involves the atrial systole, right? This involves the atrial diastole. And this part here is the ventricular diastole, and this part is the ventricular systole. So we'll talk about these. So let's just talk about, okay, when both the ventricles and the atria are relaxing, right? The first stage, the diastole, right? When the ventricles and the atria are relaxing, so this phase here we are talking about. So you can see the atria is also relaxing, okay? And then you can see the ventricle is relaxed at this stage till here. So when they are relaxing or during cardiac diastole, the semilunar valves are closed, right? Semilunar valves, meaning the pulmonary and the aortic valves are closed as the blood is being pushed in, right? Or it is like the atria is being filled, right? So as the atria is being filled with the blood, and then the blood would move into the ventricles, okay? And after that, the atria contracts, okay? So a little passive flow of blood actually takes in as the blood is being and it is entering the atria, okay? And it is relaxed, so valves would open, okay? A little blood would trickle in into the ventricles, right? But then as the atria is contracting, then definitely more blood is pushed under pressure. So at this stage, what is happening? These semilunar valves are kept closed. Both the aortic and the pulmonary valves are kept closed at this time. And these, as they close, they produce a sound which is known as dub, right? So we actually refer to the heart sounds as lub dub, right? So this is actually what causes the second heart sound, dub. Okay, the first heart sound is lub. So these semilunar valves, they close and they produce the heart sound. Remember, I said, okay, we have two heart sounds. We refer to them as S1 and S2. So this is S2, which is known as dub. What is happening because of that, ventricular pressure is decreasing due to relaxation. So as the ventricles are actually relaxed at this time, so you can see ventricles are being filled. Okay? So the muscles are relaxed and the pressure is decreasing here. Okay? Because the pressure is decreasing, so you can look at the volume as well. So you can compare this one with this one. Okay? So they are relaxed and the volume is increasing. Atrial pressure would then start increasing due to the entry of blood. Up now, the blood is entering into the atria. So with time, the pressure will start to increase in the atria, right? And then again, some pressure of the atria decreases as some blood moves into the ventricles passively. So if you look here, because initially the blood is being pushed into the atrium, okay, it is being pumped into the atrium, but right now these tricuspid valves are closed. Okay? Or if you look at the bicuspid valves, these are closed as well. Okay? So blood is entering into the left atrium and the right atrium. Okay? So shuru mein pressure is less, but then as the blood keeps on coming in, the pressure would eventually increase. Okay? So after that, what will happen? These valves would, as the pressure increases slightly, because the blood will start to trickle into the right ventricle and the left ventricle passively. ठीक है, अभी atrial contract नहीं हुआ है, but थोड़ा वहाँ pressure increase हुआ, the blood goes into the right ventricle and the left ventricle, right? So because of that, the pressure in the atria decreases. ठीक है? So जो थोड़ा pressure increase हुआ था यहाँ पे it then decreases, right? Then the pressure increases slowly in both the atria as the and ventricles as the blood is filling. Then definitely because blood is coming in, so pressure would increase slowly in both atria and ventricles, because the blood which is coming into the atrium, it is also like passively going into the ventricles as well. So pressure would increase slowly. Now, because of this, what is happening, the volume is increasing in both the atria and the ventricles due to filling of blood and extension of the heart muscles. Blood is being filled in and the heart muscles are relaxed. So eventually what will happen, the volume will increase. Okay, because blood under our MS. Okay, so the volume would increase. Right? So let's just recap. As both the ventricles and the atria are relaxed, at this time, the semilunar valves, both the semilunar valves, the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve close. This creates a second heart sound, which is known as dub, right? The ventricular pressure decreases due to relaxation. As the ventricles are relaxing, the pressure would decrease, right? So initially the atrial pressure would increase because the blood is coming in, the valves are closed here, right? But after some time, okay, the blood would passively go into the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and this would decrease the pressure from the atria a little bit, okay? But then pressure would increase again because the blood is coming in, okay? But it would increase slowly because right now the blood is actually entering the ventricle as well. Okay, the slow increase of the pressure. But then if you look at the volume is increasing both the atria and the ventricle, the blood keeps coming in and the walls are relaxed. So volume would increase because the heart muscles are extended. Okay, so this is what happens when both the ventricles and atria are relaxed. Right? So these two phases here. Then comes the atrial systole, right? So atrial systole or ventricular diastole, right? So this is the part here when the atrial systole begins. Okay, so this is the part when the atria would contract and the ventricles would relax. So atrial pressure then, as we know that the blood, it keeps on coming in, right? But then the pressure increases so much that atria, these muscles contract. So as the muscles are contracting, what is happening because of that, now the volume is decreasing because they contract. Okay, so this is space here because the blood was coming in, so muscles relaxed, the blood was pulling in. Okay, the size uska bada hota ja raha tha, volume was increased. But now as they contract, this decreases the volume. So you can look at the size. Contraction की वजह से जगह छोटी हो गई, volume decreases, but this increases the pressure now. So atrial pressure increases gradually due to contraction and slight increase in ventricular pressure due to passive filling or slow filling of blood from the atrium into the ventricle. ठीक है, अब since क्योंकि blood ज़्यादा ventricle के अंदर भी जा रहा था, so atrial pressure आहिस्ता आहिस्ता फिर increase होना शुरू हो जाएगा, ठीक है, due to contraction and slight increase in the ventricular pressure, slightly increase होगा, ठीक है, due to passive filling or slow filling of the blood from the atrium to the ventricle. What will happen now because of this contraction now? These bicuspid and tricuspid valves would open, ठीक है, अब वो पूरा खुल जाएंगे. And now the volume would decrease. As we said, it is contracting, तो उसका size is small हो रहा है, so volume would decrease, ठीक है, the pressure would increase here, ठीक है, and then this will actually lead to stretching of the ventricle because suddenly अब ये बहुत सारा blood एकदम ventricle के अंदर आ रहा है. So this would lead to stretching of the ventricular muscles. So this is what we call as atrial contraction, ठीक है, but at the same time ventricles are relaxing, ठीक है, so ventricular relaxation के पूरा phase है that you're looking at here, the lighter green portion. So atrial pressure increases gradually due to contraction, ठीक है, and slight increase in ventricular pressure due to passive filling, ठीक है, then tricuspid and bicuspid valves open, volume decreases here, ठीक है, because of contraction and stretching of the ventricles here, ठीक है, but pressure here in the atria increases. So this is what happens, ठीक है, because we have to talk in terms of changes in pressure and volume. So this much about the atrial contraction. Now coming to ventricular systole, or at the same time atrial diastole. So ventricles contract and atria relax. So we are talking about this phase here. So again, it has an early phase and a late phase. So in this case, when the ventricles are contracting, this is the time when the atrioventricular valves would close. So the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves would close, right? And this would produce the first heart sound, which we call as lub, right? So remember in the previous, when we said during cardiac diastole, or when the heart muscles are relaxing, okay, the second heart sound is produced, okay, when the semilunar valves are closed. So we call that sound as S2 and we call that lub, sorry, we call that dub. This is the first heart sound. So S1 is the first heart sound, okay, which refers to as lub. When these valves, these atrioventricular valves, they close, bicuspid, tricuspid valves close, the heart sound that is produced is known as lub, and the second heart sound is referred to as dub. It happens when the semilunar valves close. So lub dub, right? So first heart sound and the second heart sound. So the bicuspid, tricuspid valves closed. Now what is happening because of that? Because the ventricles are now contracting. Okay? So because of the ventricular contraction, what will happen? The ventricular pressure would increase. Okay? Because they're contracting right now. Okay? And then their volume would increase. Okay? Volume would decrease. So volume decreases because now they're contracting. So you can see. So look at the size here. Okay? They are starting contraction here, and now look at the size here. Okay? So the volume would decrease and the pressure would increase. Okay? So ventricular pressure increases gradually due to contraction, and because of that, now what is happening? The pressure is decreasing into the atria because atria is relaxing at the time. Okay? So because the blood has come in from the atria, so atria is relaxing at this time. These valves close. Okay? So atria is relaxing at the time, but ventricles are contracting. Now because of that, now the semilunar valves open. The aortic and the pulmonary valves open because the blood has to be pushed from the ventricles to the pulmonary artery as well as the aorta. Okay? After some time, what was happening? Because the blood is being pushed into these arteries, so the volume of the the ventricles would then start to increase in a little while, and the pressure would decrease because the blood is pushed here. But at the same time, atria still keep on relaxing. Okay? So atria, because they're expanding, okay, so they are relaxing and the ventricles are contracting. So this is what happens to the pressure and the volume when the ventricles are contracting. So bicuspid, tricuspid valves close. This produces the first heart sound, which we call as lub. Ventricular pressure is increasing because ventricular walls are contracting. So at the same time, ventricle का अपना volume कम हो रहा है, ठीक है, but the pressure is increasing. Right? At the same time, the atria are relaxing and the semilunar valves open, and then the blood is sent into these arteries, and then this is then after that, what will happen? The pressure inside the ventricle would decrease because the blood is pushed here into the arteries. So this is what happens, the changes that happen in the pressure in millimeter of mercury and volume milliliter during the cardiac cycle. So again, about the valves. So valves actually, we have talked about the valves, the names of the valves as well, but what's their role there actually, or how they prevent this backflow of blood. So these valves are controlled by pressure changes in the heart chamber. So we just saw how the pressure changes as the volume is decreasing, the pressure is increasing. So these valves are actually controlled by the pressure changes in the heart chambers. So you have to actually remember it by what is happening behind the valve and what is happening in front of the valve, right? So the high pressure behind the valve forces it to open. So high pressure behind the valve, understand it like this. For example, as the atria contracts, so the valves contract, the volume decreases, okay? But at the same time, the pressure increases. So there is pressure here, and this is the atrioventricular valve. This is the atrioventricular valve. So right now, the atria, both the atria are behind the valves, okay? ये उसके पीछे हैं, and the ventricles are in front of the valves. So if the pressure is more behind the valves, okay, this would actually cause them to open, or it would force them to open. So if there's a high pressure behind the valves, it forces it to open, right? And if there is high pressure in front of the valves, they would close. So if you look here, so as the lungs, as the ventricles are like filled, okay, and they would contract, okay, up since pressure is high here, okay, as a ventricle would contract, the volume would decrease, but the pressure would increase. If you look at these atrioventricular valves for now, pressure in front of them is more. Ventricles में pressure ज़्यादा है, so they will close now. So when the pressure behind them was more, okay, it will force them to open, and the pressure in front of them increases, it will force them to close, right? So the same happens with the semilunar valves as well. Okay? So when the pressure behind them is more, look at the ventricles, they're contracting, ठीक है, and they're pushing the blood into the artery. So when the pressure behind them, अब अगर semilunar valves को आप देखें तो semilunar valves के आगे एक तो pulmonary artery और दूसरी aorta है, ठीक है. So when the pressure behind them is more, it forces them to open, ठीक है. And when the blood enters the pulmonary artery and the aorta, ठीक है, अब since यहाँ पे pressure ज़्यादा होगा तो it will actually force them shut. See, so this is what happens to the valve. So high pressure behind the valves forces it to open. High pressure in front of the valves closes it. Clear? So you can see the atrioventricular valves here. So the white arrow, it shows the ventricular systole. So during ventricular systole means when the ventricles are contracting, right? And the black one shows you for the atrial systole when the atria are contracting, right? So you can see the papillary muscles, the cone-shaped muscles, and these are the chordae tendineae, right? So during atrial systole, when the atria is contracting, remember the ventricle is relaxing at the time, the pressure of the blood is high in the atrium, then in the ventricle, and so forces the valve open, because remember, atrioventricular valve, atria uske piche hai. Okay? So the valve open during ventricular systole, when the ventricle is contracting, the pressure of the blood is higher in the ventricle than in the atrium. The pressure of the blood pushes up against the cusps of the valve, pushing it shut. Contraction of the papillary muscles attached to the valve by the tendons prevents the valve from being forced inside out. Talking about the semilunar valves in the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. So again, the black one shows you for the ventricular diastole when the ventricles are relaxing. Okay? And the ventricles are contracting, so you can see this arrow here. Okay? So during ventricular systole, this part here, the pressure of the blood forces the valves open. Right? So the valves would open because definitely these ventricles are behind the semilunar valves now. Pressure is more there, so they would open. During ventricular diastole, the pressure of the blood in the arteries is higher than the ventricles. Pressure of the blood pushes into the cusps of valves, squeezing them shut. So have a close look at this diagram, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So this is another diagram that you can just see to understand. Okay, the valves would open when the pressure is higher behind them, right? So if the pressure is high here, this would cause the valve to open, and if the pressure in front of them is higher, it would like make them or cause them to shut, right? So they would close. So again, just another view of how the valves look like. So you can see the tricuspid valve, 3 flaps, the bicuspid valve, aortic valve, and the pulmonary valves. Right, so atrioventricular valve would open. So you see again another view. So these valves would open when the pressure is higher in the atria, okay, as compared to the ventricles. So we already discussed that passive flow bhi hota hai because jab atrium is slightly, because of the blood coming in, pressure thoda increase hota hai, okay, and this is with like before the atrial contraction, okay, so blood passively trickles down the ventricle, okay, so just as the pressure increase hota hai, valves khul jata hai, okay. But then they close when the pressure here in the ventricles is higher. So then they would close, right? So the atrioventricular valves. And the semilunar valves, they would open when the pressure is higher in the ventricle because the ventricles are behind these. Yes, ke piche hain. So when the ventricle, the pressure in the ventricle is higher, right? So these semilunar valves would open, right? And they would close when the pressure is higher in the arteries. Ab yahan pe jab pressure बढ़ जाएगा in front of the valves, so they would close shut, right? So this is a graph that you might come across in the papers as well. So isme what you need to know these 3 graphs actually. Okay, you need to know the name, and then you need to know the interpretation. What does this curve show, or what is happening in atrial systole, what is happening in ventricular systole. So we just see that. So this curve here, generally with the graph actually, it consists of 3 graphs in one, right? And it shows you the pressure changes in the left side of the heart during the cardiac cycle, right? So what is happening to the left side of the heart? So we are generally talking here about the left ventricle and the left atrium, right? And then definitely we'll be talking about the aorta, basically, because left side pe when is the aorta actually, right? So here you can see the time given in seconds. Again, this is the pressure. So this black curve that you're looking at here, the black one, is actually referring to the atrial pressure, okay, or what is actually happening at the left atria. Okay, what happens when it contracts and what happens when it relaxes. The red one that you're looking at, the one that it peaks up, this is about the ventricle. So here, this shows you what happens at the left ventricle, right? So this here is one. They actually here they have shown you two heartbeats actually, right? And then the blue one that you're looking at is the aortic pressure, right? Or what happens at the aorta. Okay, so three graphs in one. So this one is about the left atrium. This one is about the left ventricle, the red one, and the blue one is about the aortic pressure or the aorta. So in the next diagram, we'll actually talk about these in details because you should know the labeling. Okay, so interpretation of pressure changes. So we'll be referring to this diagram as well. So in order to interpret this graph, what you need to know is about the knowledge of what is happening to the valves when the pressure behind them is increasing, what happens to the valves when the pressure in front of them is increasing. So we have already talked about that the valves would open when the pressure behind them is increasing, and they would close when the pressure in front of them is increasing, right? So again, so the yellow one that you're looking at here is showing you the atrial, what is happening at the left atrium. Okay, the green curve that you're looking at, it shows showing you what happens at the ventricular level, and this one is about the aorta, right? So again, you need to know about the valves. Okay, how are they closing? How are they opening? Right. So here we are talking about the atrioventricular valves, right? Because see, atria, okay, and then this is the ventricular curve. Okay, so atrioventricular closing, atrioventricular valves are opening, and then here you're looking at as the ventricular pressure is increasing. Okay, the blood will eventually be pumped into the aorta. So now you see the aortic pressure is also increasing. So if you focus here, like this one here, so this is actually what is showing you the systole or the atrial systole, right? When the left atrium contracts. So when the left atrium contracts, so you can see there's a slight increase in the pressure, right? And the blood definitely is being filled into the ventricle. Okay? But after some time, what will happen? The pressure in the ventricle would be increased. So this would cause the atrioventricular valves to close, right? So the atria contract, okay? So the pressure increases, okay? As the pressure increases, the blood is being pumped into the ventricle, okay? Or the left ventricle basically. As the pressure with time increases in the left ventricle, the atrioventricular valve would close, right? And then this huge curve that you're looking at, okay, because the ventricular pressure is increasing, now the ventricle will contract. So this is what is actually showing you the ventricular systole. Okay, so this part here was the atrial systole. Atrioventricular valves close because now the pressure in the left ventricle is more and the left ventricle contracts. So ventricular systole. So the pressure here increases. This huge pressure that you're looking at it increases, right? But then after some time, okay, because now you also see that this like atria also opens, like the semilunar valves or the aortic valve actually opens, okay, and the blood then is pushed into the aorta. Okay, so after some time you see that the ventricle then because the volume in the ventricle actually starts to decrease now because actually the pressure is there more in the aorta. Okay, and eventually with time it would relax. Okay, and then it would relax, and then this is the point when the atrioventricular valves would open. Okay, because again you can see the atrial pressure after some time the blood will be the atria will be being filled with the blood. Okay, so because atria diastole mein hai, so blood is being actually flown into the atria, the pressure increases in the atria. Okay, and again what happens because of increased pressure, the atrioventricular valves open. Okay, and then you can see here both the ventricle and the atria are relaxing because blood is eventually is being filled in. Okay, but passively atrioventricular valve open ho jate because the pressure is increasing. Okay, then the it will keep in filling in the left ventricle. Okay, or the volume will increase as well. Okay, and then again the atria will contract and the whole cycle will be repeated. Okay, so see again when the atria contracts, right? So the pressure increases slightly. Okay, then blood is pushed into the left ventricle under pressure. Okay, this increases the ventricular pressure. Okay, and then what happens? This causes the atrioventricular valves to close. Okay, they close, ventricle contracts. Okay, so there is a huge pressure difference then. Okay, and then after some time, as then some of the blood is then pushed into the semilunar valves, it causes them to open. Okay, so blood is then pushed into the aorta as well. And now because of that, okay, the pressure in the ventricle starts to decrease because the blood is now moving into the aorta. So as the pressure decreases, so you can see this, it starts to like the pressure definitely starts to go down, and eventually the ventricle would relax. Okay, but at the same time, if you look at the semilunar valve, the aortic valve, it opens. Okay, the pressure definitely, because it is moving under high pressure. So you see here, the semilunar valves would close now. Okay, they're closing here because now the pressure in the aorta is more, right? Because as the pressure in front of them is more in the arteries now, it's more there in the aorta. Okay, so the semilunar valves would close. Okay, and you can see this graph as well. So again, have a close look, try to understand it. Right. So remember, during atrial systole, the atria contracts, right? As the atria contracts, the size actually, like as it becomes small, so this causes the volume of the atria to decrease. But because of this, the pressure increases. Okay. Now, since this blood is being sent into the ventricle, because atrial systole के अंदर ventricle relaxation होता है, ventricular diastole हो रही होती है, so volume of the ventricles would increase, okay, because blood is being pumped into the ventricles, okay, and the pressure on the ventricles would decrease, right? If you look at the ventricular systole, which is the ventricular contraction, right? But at the same time, ventricular contraction would have no effect on the volume of atria. Nothing is happening there. Okay, no relation. So ventricle contracts, no change in the volume of atria. If there is no change, definitely no change in pressure as well. Okay, but again, what would happen as it is contracting? The volume of the ventricles would decrease. Again, the size would become smaller, but the pressure would definitely increase. And this increased pressure would then send the blood into the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Then comes the part when the ventricle is relaxing, or cardiac relaxation, basically when both the chambers are relaxing, atria and ventricle as well. Okay, so volume of the atria is increasing because definitely blood is coming in from the vena cava and the pulmonary veins. Okay, and then because of this increase in atria, okay, the pressure in the atria would increase also. Okay, so pressure in atria increases. So again, this causes blood to trickle in from the atrioventricular valves into the ventricle. So the volume of the ventricle also slowly increases, and then definitely slightly pressure also increases in the ventricles. Okay, so this is one thing that you need to know about. Sometimes you can get a question related to finding out the cardiac output. So cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped around the body, right? And it depends upon two factors. So amount of blood pumped around the body. Okay, that is known as cardiac output. It depends on two factors. So one is known as the stroke volume, and it is known as the heart rate. So stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by left ventricle in each heartbeat, right? Volume of blood pumped by the left ventricle in each heartbeat, and typical value for an adult at rest is 75 milliliter. So during each heartbeat, left ventricle pumps out 75 milliliters of blood, right? Heart rate is the number of times the heart beats per minute. Typical value of an adult at rest is 70 beats per minute, right? So both of these actually contribute to cardiac output, stroke volume and the heart rate. Stroke volume is the volume that is pumped by the left ventricle in each heartbeat. Typical value is 75 milliliters for adult at rest. Heart rate is the number of times the heart beats per minute. Typical value for an adult at rest is 70 beats per minute. And when you multiply these two, stroke volume times the heart rate, it gives you the cardiac output, right? So when we talk about the cardiac output, so a typical resting cardiac output is 4 to 6 liters per minute. So this much blood, okay, is sent around the body in 1 minute, 4 to 6 liters per minute. So this can rise to as much as 40 liters per minute in highly trained endurance athletes. So again, because athletes need more oxygen to be reached to the respiring cells, right? So they need more blood actually to be traveling, right? So this cardiac output can rise to 40 liters per minute in athletes as well. So make sure you know these formulas. Okay, now coming to how the heart is coordinated. So if you remember, initially I used the term that the heart muscle is myogenic. So it has its own contraction and relaxation. It is not under the nervous or hormonal influence. So this whole coordination actually, okay, we describe the heart as myogenic, okay, and these respond to changes in the electrical charge in the heart basically, okay. So heart automatically contracts and relaxes, right? It does not require impulse stimulation from the brain or neither any hormonal control from the endocrine gland, and they actually contract rhythmically, these contractions. So when we talk about the heart coordination, right, you need to know about nodes. So in the heart, right, this cardiac cycle is controlled by two nodes. One of them is known as the sinoatrial node or the SAN, or atrioventricular node or AVN. So these nodes actually control this cardiac cycle, right? So it starts with the sinoatrial node, okay, and then sent to the atrioventricular node, right? So both of these contribute to this myogenic activity of the heart as it is contracting on its own automatically. So this myogenic muscle is actually, there's a small patch of it in the walls of the right atrium, right? And this myogenic muscle, which is found in the right atrium, is also known as pacemakers, right? So it is found on the right atrium. Okay, so there are two nodes, sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. So the sinoatrial node is actually found in the right atrium. Electrical impulses are sent from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node, coordinating heart muscle contractions. So we'll see how this happens. But remember, these are two nodes which are involved there, right? And besides these nodes, there are also like fibers which are known as bundle of His. Okay, so let me write that here. So His was the person who actually discovered them. So bundle of His. These atrioventricular nodes and branches out, take into bundle of His, and then comes the Purkinje tissue. Purkinje tissue, or we also call them as Purkinje fibers. So in some books, you might come across the term Purkinje fibers, okay, and all these are related. So sinoatrial node, atrioventricular nodes, then bundle of His, right, and then comes the Purkinje tissue or Purkinje fibers. So here you're looking at the sinoatrial node here. So see, it's at the right atrium. So this is where the contraction of the heart starts. Okay, so this is the sinoatrial node. This is the atrioventricular node you're looking at here. Okay, and these that you're looking at are the bundle of His. Okay, and then eventually they will actually, then the middle one that you're looking at here is the Purkinje tissue. Okay, and then the heart, they would actually make the ventricle contract like this. So these actually impulsive would go down first and then they will cause a heart contraction. So we'll see how this happens actually. Okay, so since we're talking about heart muscles contracting and relaxing, so definitely like it's actually the membranes of the cardiac muscle that are involved there. Okay, and they would actually polarize and depolarize. Okay, just like if you can recall the action potentials from the nervous impulses, but since there are no nervous impulses involved here, okay, so these muscles, okay, they would actually polarize and depolarize. So we will see how this happens. So these membranes around the two nodes, and the two nodes that we talked about are the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node, right? So these two nodes, okay, actually they allow actually they're maintaining a charge across the membrane. Okay, so at rest, the nodes in the heart become polarized, so they're charged. So as they're charged, what is happening? If this is the membrane, so what is happening here? The positive charges starts to build inside, okay, and the negative charges actually start to build outside. So because of this, actually, this polarity, difference in charges, okay, so this is what happens during rest, okay. But this is caused because the ions are building up. So we have more positive charges inside and more negative charges outside. Now, when a contraction occurs, so these charges will actually changes will take place here, as the contraction occurs, the nodes are depolarized. What happens at depolarization? The positive charges would start to move out, right? Okay. And what will happen because of that? There will be actually an electrical impulse, okay, and it will actually start and stimulate the heart muscles. So this is what happens during depolarization. The positive charges start to go out. So at rest, what is happening? These membranes at the two nodes, the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node, they are polarized. Polarized means, again, they maintain this barrier there. Okay, so positive charges are more outside, more inside, and the negative are more outside. As the contraction happens, the positive charges start to go outside. Okay, so this change in the charges actually causes depolarization. Okay, and this is what stimulates a move in the electricity, basically in the heart. Okay, so this is what actually bring about or start the contraction. Okay, then how is this cardiac cycle controlled? Okay, so we have talked about the nodes, but what would happen at atrial systole? So this sinoatrial node, remember we are talking about the atrial contraction right now. And the sinoatrial node is found at the right atrium. So the sinoatrial node in the upper left wall of the right atrium sends a wave, which is an electrical activity. And as it sends a wave, depolarization takes place. Depolarization means the positive charges will start to go out of the membrane. So depolarization would take place throughout the atria. So we are talking about both the atria, right? So this is not only the right atrium is contracting, it is sending the waves to the left atrium as well. So we'll see that in the diagram as well, right? So it sends the waves. In fact, if I could show you here, see, so as this contracts, so it sends the wave to the left atria as well. It goes like this, right? So both of the atria are contracting at the same time. Okay, so because of that, the walls of the atria would contract almost simultaneously. Okay, almost simultaneously. Blood is forced through the bicuspid valve from the right atrium to the right ventricle. From the left atrium to the left ventricle, and the tricuspid valve, which is from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Okay, so this is how the blood will be forced as the atria are contracting, both the atria almost simultaneously. Okay, after depolarization, the blood will be sent into the ventricles. Right, the sinoatrial node starts this contraction, atrial systole. Okay, then in ventricular systole, the atrioventricular node would now pick up the wave from the sinoatrial node. So sinoatrial node starts that, it's the pacemaker, right? So atrioventricular node would pick up the wave from the sinoatrial node, and then it sends its own wave of depolarization down the bundle of His, then into the Purkinje tissue, right? So atrioventricular node is generating its own wave of depolarization, okay, down to the bundle of His, then into the Purkinje tissue or Purkinje fibers. This causes the ventricular walls to contract, right? And this then forces the blood out of the aorta and the pulmonary valves, basically, or the semilunar valves, right? So this is what happens during ventricular systole. So in atrial systole, the sinoatrial nodes, okay, they send waves, okay, and cause the atrial contraction, and the blood is flown into the ventricles, both right and left. In ventricular systole, the atrioventricular node picks up away from the sinoatrial node, then it starts its own wave of depolarization, sends it down the bundle of His, and then to the Purkinje tissue. This causes the ventricular walls to contract and then forces the blood out of the aorta and the pulmonary valves. Okay, then. Now, this is actually an electrocardiogram or ECG, which actually shows you okay, how or what happens, the waves actually what happens at the atrial contraction, what happens at the ventricular contraction, or rather depolarization and repolarization. So several electrodes are attached to a person's chest and the limbs. These detect changes in polarization in the heart by measuring current at the skin surface. The leads are connected to a machine, which then draws this electrocardiogram or ECG. So this one part here is actually, this is known as a trace, an ECG trace. Okay? So here you're looking at an electrocardiogram. So each one of them is called as trace. So this is one trace, this is another trace, right? And it has labeling at the P. This is known as QRS complex, and then comes T. So we will see what that means. So these components of an ECG trace. So this P here actually shows you atrial depolarization. So atrial depolarization is a part when the sinoatrial node actually brings about the contraction of the atria. So you can see here, this is known as atrial depolarization, right? As the atria contracts. Okay. Then this QRS complex actually shows you ventricular depolarization because the AV node picks up a wave from the sinoatrial node, and then it sends its own wave, right? Its own wave of depolarization. So this is what is known as ventricular depolarization, this QRS complex. And then comes the ventricular repolarization. So this is the part where the ventricle will be relaxing. So ventricular repolarization. So P, Q, R, S, and T. So part P labeled represents the wave of excitation sweeping over the atrial walls as the atria is contracting. The part labeled QRS represents the wave of excitation in the ventricular walls. So you can see the ventricular depolarization. And then the T section indicates the recovery of the ventricular walls. So ventricular walls are recovering after that. Okay then, so this is actually how this cardiac cycle is coordinated. So each cardiac cycle begins in the right atrium. So you can see here, it begins in the right atrium. There's a small patch of muscle tissue in the right atrium, which we call as the Sinoatrial Node, right? It automatically contracts and relaxes all the time. And it does not need any nerve impulse. It does not need any hormonal influence to start. Okay, so that's the reason we call it as myogenic. Okay, so sinoatrial node is often called the pacemaker because this is what actually sets the pace at which the whole heart muscle beat. Okay? However, the pacemaker's rate can be adjusted by nerves transmitting impulses to the pacemaker from the brain. This means like it will actually address, let's say the heart is beating 70 times a minute, but during exercise, definitely it has to beat more. Okay? The blood has to be sent to the muscles for definitely because the muscles need oxygen there, right? So this information is coming in from the brain that the muscles need blood, so the heart has to pump more. Okay, so the pacemaker, okay, generally it sets a pace when the whole heart beats, but its rate can be adjusted. Like during exercise, because the heart has to beat more, the rate can be adjusted. So then the more contraction would be sent in to bring about more contractions, right? So this is, you can see, it starts from the right atrium and then they move into the left atrium, right? So sinoatrial, this is how it starts. Okay? Then as the muscle in the sinoatrial node, this muscle here in contracts, produces an electrical impulse which seeps through all of the muscle in the atria of the heart. So you can see all of the muscles of the atria. Okay, so you can look at the P wave here. The impulse makes the muscle in the atrial wall contract. The impulse shows up on the ECG as the P wave. So this P wave shows you that the atria have contracted. Okay, so the P wave represents the electrical activity just before the atrial systole, right? So this will happen and then definitely the atria would contract. Then the impulse sweeps onwards and reaches another patch of cells called the atrioventricular node. Now this wave would be then taken up by the atrioventricular node right here. And then this node is the only way in which the electrical impulse can get down the ventricles, because sinoatrial node is sending the impulse to the atrial only. Okay, but if it has to go to the ventricle, it has to actually come here, atrioventricular node. So atrioventricular node is the only way through this impulse actually can be sent to the ventricles, right? So it's the only way there. So atrioventricular node then delays the impulse for a fraction of a second before it travels down in the ventricles. Okay, so it delays it for a fraction of a second. It doesn't contract directly. So it delays for a fraction of a second and then it sends the wave down the ventricles. This delay means that the ventricles receive the signal to contract after the atria. Okay, so they would not contract at the same time. So they would contract after the atria, right? Right, so you can see here atrioventricular node, bundle of hairs, then the Purkinje tissue, and then you can see it goes down and then the heart actually contracts this way. Take it from down below. So the impulse moves swiftly down through the septum of the heart along the fibers known as Purkinje tissue. Once the impulse arrives at the base of the ventricles, at the base, see here, it sweeps upwards through the ventricular wall. So it comes down first and then it sweeps up. to the ventricular walls. This is shown by the QRS complex, this QRS complex, okay, and the ventricles then contract. Okay, so atrioventricular node, send it down the bundle of his, taken up by the Purkinje tissue. So it go down here and then they go up the heart muscles, the ventricular muscles, and then they contract. Then the ventricles relax, indicated by the T wave here after the contraction. Then the muscle in the sinoatrial node contracts again and the whole sequence runs through once more. So you can actually have a close look again at the diagram, go through the material. You can pause the video for a while and then we'll move on to the next part. So just to recap, these are all the phases of the cardiac cycle. We have talked about atrial systole, ventricular systole, and the cardiac diastole. Then you can actually relate it to these P waves, the QRS complex, as well as the T wave. So as atrial systole begins, as the atria starts to contract, right, it forces the blood into the ventricles, right? But then you can see the P wave here. So this happens because the atria depolarizes. Okay, so this P wave you will see at atrial systole as the atria is contracting and the blood is being forced into the ventricles. Okay, okay then. Then comes the ventricular systole when the ventricle is contracting, the first phase. So ventricular contraction pushes the atrioventricular valves close. So you can see the pressure was actually, the blood was being filled in. Okay, so at this time still the ventricles are relaxing, but then as the pressure increases, they would contract. This would close the atrioventricular valve. Okay, and as the ventricles contract, so you can see this QRS complex. The ventricles would depolarize now. So okay, ventricles are contracting, both of them. Okay, this causes the atrioventricular valves to close. So this is the first phase. The second phase is when now the blood is going towards because the pressure is high here. So see, right now the pressure was not that much, so these semilunar valves were closed. Okay, but as the ventricle contracts, the blood starts to move here towards the semilunar valves. So now they open because the pressure behind them is more. Okay, so semilunar valves open and the blood is ejected into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Right? And after that, what will happen? Because now the ventricles have contracted, now they will start to relax and you can see the ventricular repolarization. Then comes the ventricular diastole early. Okay, semilunar valves close and the blood flows into the atria. Okay, because now the pressure in the artery and the pulmonary artery is more. So the semilunar valves would close. Okay, and the ventricle would relax now. Blood would start to fill into the atrium now. Then chambers relax and the blood fills ventricles passively. Right? So this is what happens during the ventricular diastole. Okay, then so ECG or electrocardiogram is used in diagnosis. So they are used to diagnose any problems with the heart, as variations in different components of the trace can indicate a disease or any other abnormality. So ECG may be taken while the patient is relaxed, or it may be taken before, during, or after exercise. This is called a stress test, right? So we see how this pattern changes. And it usually involves the patient exercising on a treadmill while attached to an ECG machine. So they would look at any pattern in the changes in the P wave, the QRS complex, or the T wave. All right then, artificial pacemakers are devices which are implanted in people whose heart's electrical conduction system is not working properly. So if the sinoatrial node, right, is not firing properly, right, or if there's a blockage, or between, like, there's something wrong between the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node, because atrioventricular node picks away from the sinoatrial node, or there is something wrong in the bundle of his. So because of any of these, a pacemaker has to be implanted in people, and these pacemakers actually implanted in a muscle, right? So they monitor the heart's electrical activity and stimulate the ventricles or atria, depending on the situation, to contract when necessary. Impulses are transmitted down electrodes implanted in the muscular walls, right? So you can see here, pacemaker implanted, and then see how it controls the electrical conductivity of the heart. Okay, coming to cardiovascular diseases. So the inner lining of the wall of an artery, which is known as endothelium, is generally smooth and unbroken. But if it damages, lipids and white blood cells from the blood would start clumping, and they will form fatty streaks under the lining. Okay. As the time passes, more lipids and white blood cells will start to accumulate there, connective tissue would start to build there, and it would harden to form an atheroma. So atheroma is a fibrous plaque which develops there in the inner wall of an artery when it gets broken. The lumen of the artery will definitely get partially blocked due to this plaque, which also restricts the blood flow, resulting in the increase of the blood pressure. Okay. And because of this, a disease which is known as coronary heart disease develops. Okay. When these atheromas are actually formed there in the coronary arteries, because coronary arteries are the arteries which are supplying the heart muscle. Okay. So if such atheromas develop there, they would restrict the blood flow to the heart muscle. Okay. And this would actually lead to a disease which is known as myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is commonly known as heart attack. So heart attacks generally happen when the coronary arteries, the arteries which are supplying blood to the heart muscle itself, they get blocked by atheroma, right? Then diseases which affects the arteries. So aneurysm is one example. Aneurysm is actually a swelling of the artery in the shape of a balloon. So this can actually lead to hemorrhages. You must have heard about brain hemorrhages. So aneurysms can actually form there, and they're usually silent, right? Then thrombosis is a blood clot formation. So you can see here, there is a cross section of a healthy artery. So some tear actually has happened. So you can see like white blood cells, connective tissue will start to actually accumulate here. Then fatty material is also depositing around the vessel wall. This is actually blocking the lumen. So you can see the lumen is partially blocked now. This is what it was originally. It has blocked now, and this is actually what would actually block the pathway, and this can eventually lead to a blood clot actually stuck there. This will actually cause myocardial infarctions there, right? If the coronary artery is involved. And then factors that increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, so poor diet, high blood cholesterol, then cigarette smoking, high blood pressure, all of these actually are factors that can lead to cardiovascular diseases, and definitely changes in lifestyle, exercising can actually help a person actually to live a better life. So this much about the structure of the heart and the cardiac cycle, and how the electrical conductivity of heart is involved in atrial systole and ventricular systole. So that's it. So we're done with the chapter, and we start with the next chapter, inshallah, and next class.
The cardiac cycle refers to the sequence of events that occur and repeat with every heartbeat. It can be divided into two major phases, systole and diastole, each of which subdivides into several smaller phases. Systole and diastole, when not specified otherwise, refer to ventricular contraction and relaxation, respectively. Reminders: blood flows from higher to lower pressure. Contraction increases the pressure within a chamber, while relaxation lowers the pressure. AV valves open when atrial pressures are higher than ventricular pressures and close when the pressure gradient is reversed. Similarly, semilunar valves open when ventricular pressures are higher than aortic pulmonary pressures and close when the reverse is true. The cycle is initiated with the firing of the SA node that stimulates the atria to depolarize. This is represented by the P wave on the ECG. Atrial contraction starts shortly after the P wave begins and causes the pressure within the atria to increase, forcing blood into the ventricles. Atrial contraction, however, only accounts for a fraction of ventricular filling, because at this point the ventricles are already almost full due to passive blood flow down the ventricles through the open AV valves. As atrial contraction completes, atrial pressure begins to fall, reversing the pressure gradient across the AV valves, causing them to close. The closing of the AV valves produces the first heart sound, S1, and marks the beginning of systole. At this point, ventricular depolarization, represented by the QRS complex, is halfway through, and the ventricles start to contract, rapidly building up pressures inside the ventricles. For a moment, however, the semilunar valves remain closed, and the ventricles contract within a closed space. This phase is referred to as isovolumetric contraction, because no blood is ejected and ventricular volume is unchanged. Ventricular ejection starts when ventricular pressures exceed the pressures within the aorta and pulmonary artery. The aortic and pulmonic valves open and blood is ejected out of the ventricles. This is the rapid ejection phase. As ventricular repolarization, reflected by the T wave, begins, ventricular pressure starts to fall and the force of ejection is reduced. When ventricular pressures drop below aortic and pulmonary pressures, the semilunar valves close, marking the end of systole and beginning of diastole. Closure of semilunar valves produces the second heart sound, S2. The first part of diastole is, again, isovolumetric, as the ventricles relax with all valves closed. Ventricular pressure drops rapidly, but their volumes remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the atria are being filled with blood and atrial pressures rise slowly. Ventricular filling starts when ventricular pressures drop below atrial pressures, causing the AV valve to open, allowing blood to flow down the ventricles passively. The atria contract to finish the filling phase, and the cycle repeats itself.